Today, before we get started, Dylan is going to lead us in a word of prayer.
Almighty, our most holy Father and Creator above, thank you for this day. It is yours, that belongs to you, that you've given us to honor you. And we thank you for all of your love, blessings, for your Son, your grace showered upon us. We thank you that we can gather together with one another here. Thank you for this body, the love that you have given us for one another, the work that you have given us to do here together. We thank you that we can freely gather, and for all of those here. We are mindful that there are some kept away. For one reason or another, we pray that you'll be with each of them, watch over and protect them, help them to return. Over these next several minutes, we ask for your hand that we can rightly discern your teaching to us in this important book that gets into such a real subject of challenges in life that cross our paths, trying to ascertain whys that confront us in most difficult circumstances. We know that you've given us all that we need to understand your will for us. Help us to be following after your will as you intend. Thank you again for all of your love. It's in your Son's holy name that we pray.
Thank you. Why serve God? So that's the question that's before us. That's the question that Job is wrestling with. And frankly, that's really what sets this whole thing up. Because Job is known as a righteous man. Job is known as a wealthy man. When wealth was measured in terms of how much livestock you might own, how many servants you have, what the land looked like. And yet, Satan challenged God and said, no, the only reason he served you is because you do all these great things for him. And so God allows Satan to take everything Job has away from him, possessions, his children, and his own health. So his friends come along, and they're not particularly helpful.
They sit quietly with him for a few days, and finally Job speaks up, and he's frustrated with his situation. He feels like he wishes he would just die, and his friends decide they've got to speak up too because they believe they've got an answer for why all this is happening. That's because, Job, you must have done something unrighteous. Not just a little mess up, where you slipped and repented right away. This is a lifestyle of unrighteousness that you must be living in, Job. And so we've seen the back and forth throughout the chapters so far. We've gone through 22 chapters. We're about to get into 23 today. And in that back and forth, it's the same old thing. Job says, I haven't done anything that would bring this on, like you're saying. Yeah, I'm not sinless, but you're talking about a lifestyle of unrighteousness, and that just doesn't fit. That's not what I've been engaging in. And what is his friend's answer to that?
It's almost
Too much of a softball. That's why nobody's answering, right? Okay.
You have been.
Yeah. I mean, you might as well listen to kids argue, right? Because that's really what it is. And so they bring up a couple of times that no, you sow something and you can expect to reap what you sow. That's certainly what Eliphaz said in his first speech. And so you must be reaping what you're sowing, Job. And Job said, and so turn to God and things will be well with you. And Job responds by saying, no, that's not the case. Everybody goes through bad times sometimes, and so it's just my time. And then they're like, no, Job, this is so bad, you must have done something wrong. And Job's like, no, God knows that I'm telling the truth here. I wish God would be my witness so that he would, but he's not available to me. I can't just call God as my witness and have him show up. And so there's a little bit of frustration there when you get to chapter 9, and he starts talking about how this doesn't seem fair, what I'm having to go through, based upon the fact that the righteous should be rewarded, and if there is no reward, then what's the point in being righteous? All right, so Job's wrestling with that. And of course, his friends come back and say that they've ignored the fact that he says that sometimes the tents of robbers prosper. Sometimes everybody goes through tough times and it's just my time. They haven't listened to that at all. And so they're like, no, is it because you're so righteous that these things are happening to you? And Job says, no, it's not that. And he even admits then that, okay, I'm willing to say God is doing this to me, but it's not for the same reason that you must be thinking. And so he's got his other reasons, and I can't wrestle with him. I can't ever overcome God and what his purposes are, but this isn't fair. And in fact, if you keep pressing me on on the fact that I'm living an unrighteous life, name my sin. Now he's specifically in chapter 13 and verse 23 talking to God, but in front of his friends, it seems. So tell me what my sin is if that's the issue. And they don't say anything right away. There's some more exchanges that go on. Finally, one of his friends says, look, the righteous are such a way, but the evil, they're different. And here's the kind of things evil people do. And they oppress the poor and the widows and things like that. So very generically, Zophar has said, that's the kind of things evil people do. And there's the implication, of course, Job, you must be in this category. And Job says, no, God has wronged me. God has done this to me, but not for a good reason. He's wronged me in this. And Eliphaz comes along then in chapter 22. And what does Eliphaz do in chapter 22?
It's direct accusation against Job.
Okay. So I believe he goes back to this question, what have I done wrong? Or the statement, name my sin. And generically, Job's been told, well, here's the kind of things unrighteous people do. And Eliphaz in chapter 22 he gets very harsh with it. Is it because you're so righteous, sarcastically speaking, that all these things are happening to you, Job? Think about it. So you want to know what you've done wrong? I'm going to tell you what you've done wrong. All right, so what are some of those things that he's done wrong according to Eliphaz? Here's your lifestyle.
Wanted the widow and orphan, stolen from the hungry. You've basically taken from people who have nothing, crushed them like your wealth is. I think the implication here with the statements he's making is your wealth has been stolen. Like you were a wealthy, powerful man, but you took it all from other people.
Okay, yeah. You're an oppressor of the poor. That's why you're wealthy. And as bad as it gets in human terms, you've oppressed widows and orphans. You've trampled on them and their rights and taken from them. All right, so Job knows this isn't true. How are you going to respond when somebody makes an accusation this outlandish? You going to be happy, especially when you're in a miserable state as it is? I'm convinced that in chapter 23, Job is extremely agitated by this point. So it's been like, you're a sinner, Job. No, I'm not. You're a sinner, Job. No, I'm not. This proves it. No, I'm not listening to that. You're a sinner, Job. No, I'm not. Can't you see? I'm in anguish. You're not being good friends to me. You're lousy comforters. Even if I were unrighteous, you should treat me better than what you are right now. You're a sinner, Job. Straighten out. No, I'm not. Oh, yeah, well, here's what you've done. You've oppressed widows and orphans and then the poor. And it's almost like a boiling point in chapter 23 as I see it. Yes, Richard.
One of the things that must have been frustrating to Job in terms of his relationship with his friends is if they jump to the assumption or make the assumption that Job is in this condition because of his unrighteousness, then his friends, since things like that are not happening to them, they're saying, we are righteous. We're righteous and you're not righteous. So there's a little bit of, they may be puffed up a little bit about, we're not being punished. Only you are being punished.
Yeah, when we talk a little bit about, Galatians 6, that had they approached Job with a sense of, well, I'm going to help bear your burdens, and yeah, you do need to make a correction, which wasn't really the case in Job's situation, but had they approached him that way, hey, we want to help you make a correction in your life, considering themselves lest they also be tempted, as Paul tells the Galatians, that might have made all the difference in how he responds here. So let's look at chapter 23. Then Job answered and said, even today my complaint is bitter. My hand is listless because of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me and understand what he would say to me. Would he contend with me in his great power? No, but he would take note of me. There the upright could reason with him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. All right, how is Job regarding God in these few verses here?
It almost feels like he's like as you would with your own kid. Like I know exactly how they're going to respond. I know exactly how they would think as soon as I present the things that I'm going to say. And so he's kind of full of himself, thinking he's in a place of more power and more knowledge than God.
Yeah, exactly. He is actually
Putting God on a human level here. Like, all right, I know how God's going to respond. And in Job's mind, I'm going to present such great arguments. If God would just put himself here in front of me, I would give him such great arguments that he wouldn't be able to resist. It would be like, us thinking about a human judge today who's standing there. I'll get you in just a second. A human judge who's like, Job, I never thought of it that way. You got a good point there. That's how he's treating God in this case, Jack.
It really comes off like some sort of challenge to me here. Like he's wishing, he's like, okay, well, you guys are worthless. God, come down here. All right, I'm going to show you what's going on. Right. It's like directly challenging God at this point to prove himself, basically. All right, show me why you're doing what you're doing. Because I can prove it.
so.
Again, to me, this is kind of the climax of Job stepping over the line here. Now, we can make the argument in some of the past things that he said when God has wronged me. Excuse me. This isn't fair, and some of those kind of things. But now he's actually just challenging out of his frustration. I mean, he's just been accused of doing some of the worst things that humans can be charged with. Oppressing those who are totally helpless. And making his wealth off of them is probably the idea here. And so he's aggravated, and he wants God to come down and be his witness. Yeah, Kristen.
Assuming also that God is completely against him, we are reminded of the fact that God is not against him, but is showing in the beginning that this is going to be somebody who's going to exemplify, glorify him as a Savior. So he thinks he has an understanding of what's going on.
Yeah. It's
like
not
God is against him. First of all, it's not like God doesn't see what's going on, and it's not like Job's going to be able to outfox God in a debate. Yeah, please.
Look at it in a little more meek perspective, that his friends have played judge and jury this whole time. They've already convicted him. And he's saying, if I could go to God, who is the only true judge, and speak, find out, like he said in chapter 13, find out what my sins, I would repent. He wants to go to the true judge instead of his friends casting the lot on him. He kind of feels like he's paying the consequences for something he doesn't understand and not being able to speak to the judge.
Yeah, and that
I
frustration.
believe has built up. And early on, that may have been where he was coming across. God's the one who would know. But in this case, he is, he's stating things like, I know what God would say even before he would say it. I would have my arguments ready. So he has clearly at this point gone and overstated his case of righteousness before God. Okay. What? Did I see anybody else? What's his problem, though? Again, he's already said it before, several chapters ago, when you look at verse 8. Unfortunately, God doesn't just come down and answer my call, does he? And in fact, as we know the story of Job, sometimes you get what you ask for, and you do not fill your mouth with arguments the way you thought you would when you come before the presence of God. It's interesting, when he does get that opportunity, he has absolutely nothing to say. And God doesn't let him off the hook just because he didn't understand what was going on. So we'll get there. All right, so I can't come before God. I go forward, but he is not there, and backward, but I cannot perceive him. When he works on the left hand, I cannot behold him. When he turns to the right hand, I cannot see him. But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food. But he is unique, and who can make him change? And whatever his soul desires, that he does. For he performs what is appointed for me, and many such things are with him. Therefore I am terrified at his presence. When I consider this, I am afraid of him. For God made my heart weak, and the Almighty terrifies me, because I was not cut off from the presence of darkness, and he did not hide deep darkness from my face. And so he's probably calmed down a little here, and he's understanding, I just can't go before God and get the answer that I'm looking for, and I can't change his ways. And so I'm going to have to deal with this, even though it's frustrating. And I know I'm righteous, though, that I have not forsaken his ways. And I'm going to stand by that no matter what you guys keep saying. All right, so we get it. Anything else on chapter 23? Somebody want to read 1 through 12 of 24? Yeah, Jack.
Why are not times of judgment kept by the Almighty? And why do those who know him never see his days? Some move landmarks, they seize flocks and pasture them. They drive away the donkey of the fatherless, they take the widow's ox for a pledge. They thrust the poor off of the road, the poor of the earth all hide themselves. Behold, like wild donkeys in the desert, the poor go out to their toil, seeking their gain. The wastelands yield food for their children. They gather their fodder in the field, and they glean the vineyard of the wicked man. They lie naked without clothing, and have no covering in the cold. They are wet with the rains of the mountains and cling to the rock for lack of shelter. There are those who snatch the fatherless child from the breast, and they take a pledge against the poor. They go about naked without clothing. Hungry they carry sheaves. Among the olive rows of the wicked they make wool. They tread the wine presses but suffer thirst. From out of the city the dying groan. The soul of the wounded cries for help. Yet God charges no one with wrong.
So what picture is he painting here then?
God lets all kinds of injustice happen.
Okay, lots of times when we look around.
The unrighteous seem to flourish and prosper.
Somebody over here going to say something too.
He opens up this stretch here saying, why is it that the righteous don't see? So he has acknowledged in some of his past speeches that in the long run, what Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar are saying surely is the case, that God's not going to allow unrighteousness to go on forever, that good will triumph over evil eventually. But he's saying here, why is it that the righteous don't get to see that happen? That just doesn't seem fair to me, that righteousness has to wait. We're having to wait on God. Yeah, he's going to deliver someday, but we should be able to see it. Look on past that, verses 13 through 25. In particular, verses 18 through 21. They should be swift on the face of the water. Their portion should be cursed in the earth, so that no one would turn into the way of their vineyards. As drought and heat consume the snow waters, so the grave consumes those who have sinned. The wound should forget him. The worm should feed sweetly on him. He should be remembered no more, and wickedness should be broken like a tree. For he preys on the barren who do not bear, and does no good for the widow. Job is saying how things ought to be in these verses. All right, so he said, this doesn't seem fair that the righteous don't get to see God prevail, that good overcome evil in all cases. Why is that? And then, as he continues his speech, he's saying, this is how it ought to be, where we do get to see the wicked fail. All right, so when God comes along later and he asks Job to tell him how things are run in the universe and on the earth, explain to me the simplest things of why nature does this and why this happens, the design of it all. And Job couldn't answer a thing. Are you starting to see maybe why God is asking Job these questions? Because Job is trying to say here, this is how it ought to be. God, you're making a mistake in how you're running things. Sometimes, our children, when they're real young especially, they don't understand why mom and dad do some of the things that they do they? And, sometimes we say, you're just going to have to trust us. You're going to have to bear with us, because they can't understand all the ramifications. As they get older, maybe we explain a little bit more to them about the whys and what's good for them and what's not. That's what God does with us sometimes. Is God sometimes lets us know what the downside of sin is, and he lets us know about his gifts that they're for our good always, as Moses tells Israel in Deuteronomy. But sometimes God doesn't give us all the answers, and we are asked to trust God anyway and put our confidence in him. And so even though we may not get to see the conclusion of the matter, and we may not in our lifetimes get to see good triumph over evil the way that it would satisfy us, but God sees it all, and God's taking note of all things. So that's kind of the summation of Job's speech here. He's frustrated. He thinks it's not fair, and he thinks that the righteous ought to be able to see when good triumphs over evil. Verse 22, but God draws the mighty away with his power. He rises up, but no man is sure of life. He gives them security, and they rely on it. Yet his eyes are on their ways. They are exalted for a little while, then they are gone. They are brought low. They are taken out of the way like all others. They dry out like the heads of grain. Now, if it is not so, who will prove me a liar and make my speech worth nothing? So he goes back to the same thing he's been saying. I understand that in the long run, God's going to take care of things. It just doesn't seem right that we don't get to see that happen, and especially in my case right now. Now, who speaks next? Bildad speaks up. And somebody read read the whole chapter 25. It's a short. Who's got that? Dylan?
Then the Shuvite answered, dominion and awe belong to him, who establishes peace in his heights. Is there any number to his troops, and upon whom does his light not rise? How then can a man be just with God? Or how can he be clean, who is born of woman? If even the moon has no brightness, and the stars are not pure in his sight, how much less man, that maggot, and the sons of man, that worm?
So we take these few verses in the speech of Bildad, and first of all, this may be the best speech that any of his friends give throughout. And we might even look at these words and we might say, amen, Bildad, that is absolutely the truth. And it is, except Bildad is continuing, his idea behind this is a continuation of their same arguments. Job has just spent 2 chapters talking about his righteousness, in particular the latter part of chapter 23, his righteousness and how he's going to cling to it because he knows beyond the shadow of a doubt that he is, in fact, righteous. And he's not going to say anything differently. That's what Bildad is responding to, I'm convinced of here. That you say you're righteous, but seriously, Job, you're standing before God saying all these things. How righteous can man really be? All right? And that's true. But again, there's a little bit of a barb there that's the same line of reasoning that they've had before. He's speaking against Job's righteousness, and basically he's saying, you must not be all that righteous. Although, objectively speaking, when we all stand before God, none of us can we can't hold a candle to God. We're all unrighteous, unprofitable servants. All right, so these 3 chapters, comments or questions, I'm hoping, it's what I'm hoping, that we get through chapter 25 today, 26 today, and then we set the stage for 27 through 31 next Sunday. So we've got 9 chapters in 2 weeks to cover, and we've just covered 3, so I'm feeling sort of good, maybe. All right, questions on, this is lesson 4. I had reason behind how I broke up the lessons, but we're going to kind of run them together, lessons 4 and the first part of lesson 5. But questions or comments so far? Yes.
When I was reading chapter 25, and I could be kind of interpreting it wrong either, but Job ended chapter 24 by basically offering up this question, right? If you can prove me wrong, do it. And then you get to 25 when Bildad responds, and it's almost like he's saying, I don't know, Job, but you're still wrong. Yeah, you're right. He says a lot of truth in there, but he doesn't really, he doesn't directly kind of respond to Job. It's more just to say, well, we all know all these truths, and so you're still a sinner somehow.
Yeah, he really hasn't changed the proposition
that they've been presenting all along, has he? Even though that just the words themselves seem like pretty good words, if we took them in a vacuum in particular, outside of what's been going on with these exchanges. All right, so we get to chapter 26. Anything else on through 25? All right, how about if somebody reads chapter 26, all 14? Tristan?
But Job answered and said, how have you helped him who is without power? How have you saved the arm that has no strength? How have you counseled one who has no wisdom? And how have you declared sound advice to many? To whom have you uttered words? And whose spirit came from you? The dead tremble, those under the waters and those inhabiting them. Sheol is naked before him, and destruction has no covering. He stretches out the north over empty space. He hangs the earth on nothing. He binds up the water in his thick clouds, yet the clouds are not broken under it. He covers the face of his throne and spreads his cloud over it. He drew a circular horizon on the face of the waters at the boundary of light and darkness. The pillars of heaven tremble and are astonished at his rebuke. He stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding he breaks up the storm. By his spirit he adorned the heavens. His hand pierced the fleeing serpent. Indeed, these are the mere edges of his ways. And how small a whisper we hear of him. For the thunder of his power, who can understand?
Okay, how have you helped,
Friends, what wisdom have you offered that's of any use? And there's almost the connotation here that he's saying, how is it that you act like you can speak for God when you have no power at all? You have no wisdom at all. On the contrary, who does have wisdom, and what are some of the things he does? I believe that's his point here as he goes in. What does he say in these next few verses after that? Who demonstrates true wisdom and power? Obviously, God is doing that. In what ways? And let me, before you answer that, verse 14, he talks about the ways of God and the power of God and the things he does. And he says in verse 14, these are only the mere edges of his ways. This is only a glimpse into the ways and the power and the wisdom of God. This is just, we can't contain the whole thing. We can't describe the whole thing. So this is just a little glimpse. Therefore, who could understand it in full? Who could have a full grasp of what God can do and what his wisdom and his power is all about? All right, so what are some of the things that he mentions here that are just this little glimpse?
Nothing.
He hangs the earth on nothing. Okay, what else?
Stirs up the sea with his power, and by his understanding, he breaks up the storm, his control over nature.
Yeah, complete control over nature.
Finds up water in the clouds. He draws a circle on the horizon. There's some things here, by the way, that we don't often associate with the science and the knowledge of mankind at this time. And yet Job knows about it because God can reveal, it was never a secret to God that the earth's round, right? And that there's a circle on the horizon and how the clouds work. And all these things, they're not a mystery to God. And they weren't a mystery to Job either, because Job understood, well, not entirely. Job understood that God is the one who hung the earth on nothing. So there's not a man holding up the earth or a turtle or I don't know how long, what are all the fables and the stories about how the earth was supported. Job understood that it wasn't any of that. It was God doing it, and God could hang it on nothing. Now, he couldn't understand all the implications and all the things that how God works in full, but he could understand these things. So I think it's interesting, just kind of an aside, that Job had a scientific understanding that was beyond what many people would have in the past considered available to people of that time. And no wonder, because excuse me, it's an inspired book. When we get to chapter, we may have to end a few minutes early if this doesn't. All right, we get to chapter 27. Moreover, Job continued his discourse and said, as God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter. All right, so real quickly, God has taken away my justice. Notice, this is how Job is feeling. As long as my breath is in me, and the breath of God in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. Far be it from me that I should say you are right. Till I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. Thank you so much. I will not put away my integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast and will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live. Is Job overstating his righteousness here, or is he just giving a firm commitment that I'm going to do right no matter what, and I'm also not going to admit wrong when I haven't done wrong? Which is it?
To me, it kind of sounds like a lot of songs that we sing today, how we're kind of doing a commitment to God through song. And sometimes there's very serious implications of songs that might be ways over, but these are pretty hard and fast commitments, I would say. But I think there is a little bit of I haven't done anything really to provoke what's happened to me. So he's already kind of stated that before.
Yeah.
I'm fine with the notion that he's just spouting out his resolve that he's going to commit himself to God. Isn't that what we do when we sing the song? I'll be a friend to Jesus. Remember that song? I will not forsake. Well, no, that's not the one, because that's God talking to us, right? All right. There's some other, come on, help me out with some songs here. When we're making a commitment to God, I'll be a friend to Jesus. I surrender all. This is what I'm going to do. I shall not be moved. Leaning on the everlasting arms. That's what I'm going to do. And so there's nothing wrong with stating a commitment. However, what's the catch? We're not righteous because we sing it. We're righteous because we follow through and really do put our trust in God and really do put His ways above everything else. So that commitment is more than just words. So when we're singing the song, it has to be more than just a way to make myself feel better, a way to establish some self-righteousness so that I can feel better. Same thing would apply to Job too. It had to be something more than just words. But I believe Job here, that I'm righteous, that's how I'm going to be. That doesn't mean he didn't slip up. It doesn't mean that he doesn't need to repent when God stands before him or comes before him. He had overstated his case in some ways, and he needed to think about that. Nevertheless, the original premise of this book is that Job is a righteous man. There's opportunity for him to grow, sure, but he's righteous. And that's what we're going back to here, is that all these things that are happening to me, they're not happening because I have this high level of unrighteousness in my character and in my life. All right, so chapter 27, may my enemy be like the wicked, and he who rises up against me like the unrighteous. For what is the hope of the hypocrite? Though he may gain much, if God takes away his life, will God hear his cry? When trouble comes upon him, will he delight himself in the Almighty? Will he always call on God? All right, so here Job is contrasting himself with the ways of the wicked. I'm going to call upon God always. The wicked, is he going to always call upon God? And of course, no is the answer to that. I will teach you about the hand of God. What is with the Almighty, I will not conceal. Surely all you have seen it. Why then do you behave with complete nonsense? I've tried to tell you that God doesn't always punish the wicked right away. Now, we did see in some of his friends' arguments near the end, before Eliphaz said what he did in chapter 22, that maybe they were willing to acknowledge, yes, Job, we understand that sometimes robbers prosper, but only for a little while. And Job's trying to say, no, sometimes it lasts a lifetime. Even though that doesn't seem right in our eyes, sometimes it lasts for a lifetime. And so he's continuing on with that idea that I'm going to be righteous, but that's not the ways of my enemy. And I'm going to teach the ways of God, even though you might not like it and you might not see it. I'm still going to do that. And so you're still behaving with a bunch of nonsense because you're not taking into account things that should be readily available to you, readily apparent to you. This is the portion of a wicked man with God, verse 13, and the heritage of oppressors received from the Almighty. If his children are multiplied, it is for the sword, and his offspring shall not be satisfied with bread. Those who survive him shall be buried in death, and their widows shall not weep. Though he heaps up silver like dust and piles up clothing like clay, he may pile it up, but the just will wear it, and the innocent will divide the silver. He builds his house like a moth, like a booth which a watchman makes. The rich man will lie down, but not be gathered up. He opens his eyes, and he is no more. Terrors overtake him like a flood. A tempest steals him away in the night. The east wind carries him away, and he is gone. It sweeps him out of his place. It hurls against him and does not spare. He flees desperately from its power. Men shall clap their hands at him and shall hiss him out of his place. Job's still confident that good will overcome evil. He wishes he could see it, but he's still confident that that's what's going to happen. That's what a righteous person does. that's the thing. Maybe Job's coming back around to the fact that I need to trust in God. I need to wait on God and understand that his ways are above my ways. And I believe it's unfair. I wish I could see it. But maybe he's starting to reckon with the idea that, maybe we just don't always see it, but it's going to happen, because if God said so, then that's just, it may as well have already happened in the big scheme of things. All right. Other things on chapter 27 here. We've got a couple of minutes, maybe 3 minutes. Yes.
As we kind of finished up through verse 25, and we've seen 6 arguments from Job's friends, do you see there's any kind of lesson there for us on how to approach people who are dealing with sin, or maybe not a direct lesson, but something we can learn from that?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that we've tried to ask some questions on throughout is,
How would it have helped that his friends approached Job differently? And we don't know that for sure, but you got to believe, based upon some of the things that are written in Galatians 6, for example, that if you approach somebody in a spirit of gentleness, considering yourself lest you also be tempted, that's godly advice, and it can't hurt to do that. When fathers are told not to provoke their children to wrath, that ties in as well. And so here's the question that we run into sometimes. How do I be strict with sin, which we should be, while at the same time kind and bearing others' burdens in a spirit of gentleness, or correcting in a spirit of gentleness? How do we accomplish that? And you look in the Bible and you're going to see several examples of things that seem to have a wide scale of what our responses might be. And so when Jesus was in front of the commoners, we'll call them, the people, the multitudes, what was his approach, generally speaking?
he was compassionate.
Here are people without a shepherd. Knowing what the leaders in Israel had done and how they had treated their people, certainly that was an added element to it, wasn't it? When we see, the parable or the story, the account of the Good Samaritan in Luke 10, the holy people of Israel were not particularly compassionate, and yet this bad old Samaritan was compassionate. You see Jesus talking to the woman at the well, who clearly had not necessarily led a good lifestyle, right? And he told her, he talked to her, and he gave her instruction. He didn't condone her sin. He gave her a direction to go to escape the sin. When you see later on, when the woman who they had brought before Jesus and said, we caught her in the very act of adultery, and what's he tell them? Let he who is without sin cast the first stone. And he told the woman, after they had all left, feeling a little guilty about their own situations, and he told her, sin no more, don't sin. There's a lot of things we could talk about in that account. I mean, where was the guy? If she's caught in the act, why is he not there? Is this just a big setup or whatever? But nevertheless, Jesus never condoned sin. He told people, but what is the attitude of these people, the multitudes, generally speaking? Did they act like they had all the answers? They were people who were seeking and willing to say, I am a sinner, just like the publican and the Pharisee in Luke 18. Now, when somebody is not acting in a way where they feel like they're convicted by their sins, then how does Jesus and how do the apostles treat those? There's a lot more harshness there, isn't there? Peter got withstood by Paul to the face, Paul tells the Galatians in chapter 2. Peter knew better than to act the way that he had, and yet he was acting like a cowardly hypocrite, and he needed to be addressed to the face. And we are out of time, aren't we? All right, so there's the short answer. I guess we could talk about that a lot. because there's a lot of value. I mean, sometimes sin calls for harshness because sin will destroy souls, and we can't conclude that, well, one little sin ain't that big a deal. One little sin caused Jesus to die on the cross. So we can't be dismissive of sin, but we can be